Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. The state of emergency continues in British Columbia as many residents prepare for another huge storm. We hear from the founder of Real Agriculture, who discusses how damaging the floods have been to so many producers in BC. And first responders in our city are being recognized in a special way thanks to an initiative by Lethbridge Church.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. As another devastating storm moved into British Columbia, the province extended the state of emergency and gas rationing. The Trans Mountain pipeline, which supplies much of the Lower Mainland and Island with fuel, remains offline.
The significant weather that we have seen continues to create challenges for Trans Mountain and the transport of fuel through the pipeline. After meeting with Cabinet this morning, I'm announcing today that we're extending the temporary order to limit fuel for non-essential vehicles until December 14th, 2021. This order applies in the Lower Mainland to Hope region, Sea to Sky region, the Sunshine Coast, Gulf Islands, and Vancouver Island. Given the extension of the fuel order and the continued threats of storms and flooding, we are also extending the provincial state of emergency through to the end of day on December 14th. Extending the state of emergency will support the ongoing response and recovery from the widespread damage already caused by flooding, while positioning us to take all necessary steps in the days ahead.
Environment Canada says up to 200 millimeters of rain may fall on the Central Coast and parts of Vancouver Island during the province's third atmospheric river. Officials say the consecutive storms, along with melting snow from higher elevations, could result in even more flooding. The BC government is urging people to be prepared to leave their properties if evacuation orders are issued. Flood warnings have already been issued for the Coldwater, Coquihalla, Nicola, and Tulameen rivers. The flooding in BC has devastated so many farmers and ranchers. Sean Haney is the founder of Real Agriculture in Lethbridge. It's a group that provides insight in the agriculture industry. Haney says Ottawa needs to step to the plate right away to help our producers who have lost so much.
It's unprecedented and in some ways extremely unbelievable, and more poor weather on the way. And who had ever heard of an atmospheric river prior to what we've seen in British Columbia? Livestock producers dealing with, trying to keep their livestock on more drier land. And of course, then we have the transportation sector, the railways, and trying to rebuild that. I think there's going to be a big ask to not only the province of British Columbia, but also the federal government to assist in some of those repairs that need to happen. I was talking to David Shednovic from CN Rail today in an interview, and he said, getting the rail back working, it's a matter of our economy. Like, so much of our economy is based on trade-related matters, and getting goods from the interior part of the country to, say, the Port of Vancouver is just such a huge part of what we do, not only in agriculture, but other sectors as well. And not all that traffic can be rerouted. So I think there's going to be a big ask here for the federal government, and they seem to be up to the challenge. There's been a lot of talk from MPs about, the Minister of Transport is a good example, talking about the gravity of the situation. So I think the government's going to hopefully come through on some of those financial needs, because it can't all be left up to the citizens of BC.
As for our weather here in southwestern Alberta, it's been pretty mild and dry thanks to the strong Chinook winds. Jeanette Rocher is here with a quick peek at the weather forecast. Jeanette, we've had an incredible autumn so far, but the cooler temperatures may be on the way?
Well, first, we're going to hit some warmer temperatures into the teens tomorrow there. Wednesday, you can see that high of 17 degrees. But there is a cooling trend approaching. So by the end of the week, we're going to see a high of 0. By the weekend, single digits. But even when we're in those single digit temperatures, we're still sitting at higher than above averages for this time of year. So we're still in great shape. Also, it looks like there's some rain in the forecast this week. I'm going to have more details coming up for you later on in the newscast.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeanette. Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Deena Hinshaw, offered an update today on the Omicron variant of COVID-19, which he says has a large number of mutations. There's one confirmed case in Alberta, a person who traveled from Nigeria who is now in isolation.
Most of what we know is really based on the genetic sequencing, where we look at all of the genes in this particular variant. We know that there are a large number of mutations present on the spike protein, which is the protein that is typically the target of neutralizing antibodies that are generated both after an infection and also after someone receives the vaccine. We know that there are a few mutations in other parts of the genetic sequence as well, and so we're still learning how that might impact the behavior of this virus.
Meanwhile, South Africa's envoy in Ottawa is criticizing Canada's ban on travel from southern African nations as both shocking and knee-jerk after scientists from her country discovered the new variant and reported it to the World Health Organization. The province announced that the pediatric Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine is now available for kids 5 to 11. Now, for our poll question, we asked if you're planning on having your child age 5 to 11 vaccinated against COVID-19 in light of the new variant. Well, close to 93% of you said no. Only 7% of you said yes. Make sure you log on to our website, bridgecitynews.ca, for our newest poll question, which has to do with holiday shopping. Alberta's latest budget outlook shows that jobs are up, the deficit is down, and oil and gas prices have surged. Finance Minister Travis Taves says the deficit is expected to be $5.8 billion when the government closes the books this fiscal year on March 31st. That's almost one-third of the deficit Taves predicted when he tabled the budget last February. Since then, Alberta's resource-driven economy has sailed higher than expected, with demand increasing as the global economy slowly emerges from COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. Lethbridge East MLA Nathan Neudorf is on his way to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Neudorf is representing Alberta at the 2021 Council of State Governments National Conference. The purpose of the trip is to work with legislators and provide Alberta's perspective on key policy issues, including the importance of trade, investment, energy infrastructure, and economic growth for our province. Now, in a release statement, MLA Neudorf had this to say: CSG National is a valuable opportunity to strengthen our province's ties with the member states and advance opportunities for Alberta and the region. Building and fostering these relationships is more important now than ever to ensure Alberta's economy rebounds and grows. The conference runs December 1st through the 4th. 2 Lethbridge police officers heard their fate today during a disciplinary hearing held at the Galt Museum in Lethbridge. Jeanette Rocher joins us now in studio and has the details. Jeanette?
Well, Hal, officers Matthew Rilkoff and David Easter have both been demoted from their rank of Senior Constable Level 2 to First Class Constable Level 1 for their involvement in a social media chat room dubbed Meme Militia. Each officer pleaded guilty on November 2nd of this year to participating in chat room discussions that took place over a 4-month period back in 2018 that disseminated disparaging memes of upper management of the Lethbridge Police Service and of Lethbridge West MLA Shannon Phillips. The officers pleaded guilty to 4 counts, including engaging in discreditable conduct, insubordination, and neglect of duty. 2 other counts were withdrawn. Wilkoff and Easter submitted a joint statement of facts admitting that the communications were offensive and against LPS policies and were, quote, profane, abusive, and insulting, and targeted the LPS executive, other officers, and society in general. In their joint submission, both officers felt that a demotion would be a fair punishment, and in the end, the presiding officer agreed, demoting both of the officers by 2 grades for a period of 1 year, beginning December of 2021. 3 other officers have also been charged with misconduct in this same matter. 2 have now resigned, and the remaining officer, Jason Moulton's proceedings are still ongoing. He'll find out the fate of his career on January 10th of 2022. LPS is not able to provide further comment at this time in order to maintain the integrity of the ongoing process. We did, however, reach out to MLA Shannon Phillips, but she was unable to be reached by airtime today. Hal?
Thanks so much, Jeanette. Our first responders have been holding strong on the front lines for nearly 2 years during the pandemic. McKillop United Church in Lethbridge is doing their part to show how they care about the work that's been done to keep us safe. The Let's Show Our First Responders We Care program has letters available at the church for those who want to write a kind word or two to our first responders. The church is also asking for donations of non-perishable food items to donate to our men and women on the front lines.
what we're looking for are things that are slightly more nutritious but still snack-like. So things like beef jerky, granola bars, protein bars. People could get fruit snacks if they wanted. A couple of the first responders that we had talked to were like, oh, we love popcorn in the break room, so we're asking for that, as well as magazines, puzzle books, things that aren't food-related that people could use, and then things like Gatorade, Powerade, and coffee, tea, and hot chocolate.
Now you can drop off donations at McKillop United Church until Thursday. Today is Giving Tuesday. The day has been touted as a global generosity movement in both Canada and the United States. As Micah Quinn explains, the Community Foundation of Lethbridge in southwestern Alberta dished out kindness grants to 10 organizations here in our region.
Random Act of Kindness Day was celebrated by the Community Foundation on November 5th. Everyone who participated in Random Act of Kindness Day was asked to share their kind acts with the Community Foundation, which were then entered into a random draw for the chance to award a $500 kindness grant to a local charity of the winner's choosing. Now that today is Giving Tuesday, the foundation dished out 10 $500 kindness grants.
And then the recipients who receive the kindness grants aren't expecting it. They don't have to apply for it. Somebody chooses them as their favorite charity or the charity they think needs the most help at this time. So that's just it's a win-win for those groups because, again, they're not expecting it. It's an affirmation. Somebody believes enough in their work that they're going to choose them for a grant.
The Clairsome Arts Society were one of the winners of the grant. The society has been in the town of Clairsome since 2013, and they do an annual music theater production every January. The production manager for the society, Carmel Steele, says the Arts Society was unable to perform or bring people together during COVID.
We probably lost, I don't know, I think it's between $8,000 and $10,000 over the course of COVID through expenses. For me, this $500 will help offset some of the expenses that still occur through COVID, like rent and insurance and things like that have to be paid regardless of whether we are doing any activities or not. So I was really happy to hear that, there's a great donation that's coming our way.
The Community Foundation works closely with donors who have helped the charity award over $2 million in grant funding through Lethbridge and southwestern Alberta. This is just in 2020 alone. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
The federal NDP says the emergence of the Omicron variant makes it more urgent for Ottawa to support patent waivers to allow poor nations to manufacture vaccines against COVID-19. They argue the Liberals' refusal to support waivers shows they're more interested in protecting Big Pharma.
Speaker, no one is protected from COVID-19 until everyone is protected. Yes. The Omicron variant makes this clear. For months, health experts, the WHO, and New Democrats urged this government to ensure vaccines are available around the world. This is not just for equity reasons, but because it's essential to keep Canadians safe from new COVID variants. Not only did Liberals ignore this advice, they opposed developing countries manufacturing vaccines for their own citizens. Will the Liberals stop defending Big Pharma and start protecting Canadians?
Yes.
The Honourable Minister for International Development.
The COVID-19 pandemic does not recognize borders and will only be overcome through coordinated global action. We've been very clear from the start, no one is safe until everyone is. We committed to donate the equivalent of at least 200 million COVID-19 vaccine doses to the COVAX facility by the end of 22, Mr. Speaker.
Political reporter Brian Lilly says when it comes to dealing with the new variant known as Omicron, Ottawa should really follow the lead of the Brits, which has what's called a red list.
And one thing that I'd recommend is that the federal government in Ottawa seriously look at what the British government is doing in the UK. They have what's called a red list. And if your country is put on the red list, automatically a whole set of protocols kick in. If you're coming into the country from a red list destination, then testing protocols kick in, quarantine protocols kick in. This is not the first time that we've had a huge spike.
Mr. Lilly will also discuss if the Trudeau Liberals are considering another lockdown. He'll have details coming up in the second half of our program. The federal government tabled a tougher new bill to ban conversion therapy here in Canada. The legislation, if passed, would make practices designed to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity illegal.
The bill we introduced in the House today proposes 4 new criminal code offenses: causing any person to undergo conversion therapy, removing a minor from Canada to subject them to conversion therapy abroad, profiting from providing conversion therapy, And fourthly, promoting or advertising an offer to provide conversion therapy. These dangerous practices simply must end.
Everyone deserves to live a true life, free from discrimination, free from persecution. Yet LGBTQ2 communities continue to experience high rates of harassment, bullying. They are victims of violence simply for being themselves.
Devin Hargraves, who was a federal Liberal candidate here in Lethbridge, spearheaded the campaign to have conversion therapy banned, not just in our city, but across Canada. Hargraves says the fact that the bill is back on the table is something he's looked forward to.
Conversion therapy is the horrific practice of trying to change one's gender or identity from being a member of the LGBTQ2+ community to being straight heterosexual. It's been long regarded as almost a form of torture. I think that the fact that it's been allowed to be legal for this long in Canada is a very sad stain on our history. I'm happy that myself and many other advocates have been able to get this to the forefront and to get this addressed. And I think Prime Minister Trudeau and our Minister of Justice, David Lametti, have made a very strong point by making this one of the first 4 pieces of legislation that they are trying to pass.
A plan to bring high-speed internet and better cell phone service to remote areas of Manitoba is moving forward. The province signed an agreement with ExploreNet Communications to provide broadband service to almost 30 First Nations and around 350 rural and northern communities. Much of the infrastructure to be used will be Manitoba Hydro's fiber optic network. Government officials say the work should be completed in about 2.5 years.
The historic partnership will connect Manitoba to the world, giving unserved and underserved communities reliable telecommunications services. Over 125,000 rural, remote, and northern Manitoba homes will have new or improved modern broadband services and further future technologies for the next generations.
Marcus Lamb, a well-known Christian broadcaster who was founder and president of Daystar Television, has died. The network was very popular with evangelical and charismatic Christians. In recent weeks, friends and supporters were being asked to pray for his recovery from COVID-19. His wife, Joni Lamb, says her husband, who also battled diabetes, had been hospitalized with the virus after his oxygen levels dropped. In addition to his wife, Joni, Marcus is survived by his daughters, Rachel and Rebecca, and his son, Jonathan. Marcus Lamb was just 62 years of age. So sad and so young. Well, we've been enjoying unseasonably warmer temperatures here in Lethbridge thanks to the strong Chinook winds, but cooler temperatures and the possibility of rain is on the way. Full weather details are on deck. We have been enjoying some very mild temperatures for this time of year with the strong Chinook winds across much of southwestern Alberta. Jeanette Rocher is back with a full look at the weather forecast. Jeanette, we should enjoy the double-digit temperatures while we can since the mercury may be falling soon?
Yes, we should. That is, if you can stand the wind while you're out there. Overnight, we're still going to be feeling those gusty winds, gusting up to 90 kilometers at times. Into tomorrow, still windy. We're looking at wind gusts of 70 to 90 kilometers per hour, and then diminishing to 50 to 70. So still going to be gusty tomorrow. High of 17, though, tomorrow. If we actually reach that, we could reach a record breaker there. Last time a record was broken on that day was back in 1969. It was just over 14 degrees, so we'll see how that pans out for tomorrow. 30% chance of showers on Thursday, high of 5 degrees. There's that 0 I was telling you about before for Friday. Lots of sunshine though, and then up to 2 for the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and then 4 degrees on Monday. So even though we get down to those double digits, or rather the single digits, we're still looking at higher than average highs for this time of year. Average high is 1 degree, average low -10. 17 degrees was our high on this day back in 1969, and in 1975 we had a freezing -28 degree day. 8:06 is when the sun rose this morning, and our sun set this afternoon at 4:35 p.m. We're sitting at about 2 minutes of less daylight today than we were yesterday. Heavy rainfall on the west coast, particularly Vancouver, under a rainfall warning in effect. Long periods of rain expected today, tomorrow, and through the night this evening, up to 60 millimeters by tomorrow there. Victoria also expecting some rain, heavy winds there. Edmonton sitting sitting at 5 degrees, mix of sun and cloud, and Calgary sitting at 14 tomorrow with a mix of sun and cloud as well. 6 degrees tomorrow in Saskatoon with mainly cloudy skies. Partly cloudy skies in Regina, 8 degrees the high, and 4 degrees the high tomorrow in Winnipeg. All three of those prairie cities, the wind looking at 30 to 50 kilometer per hour wind gusts. Toronto sitting at 4 degrees tomorrow with partly cloudy skies. Flurries in Ottawa tomorrow, 1 degree the high, and Montreal seeing some snow there as well with a high of 1 degree. As we look to the east coast, sitting in Atlantic Canada, we've got Fredericton with a high of 3 degrees, mix of sun and cloud. Now, Halifax could see a mix of rain and snow tomorrow, 4 degrees the high, 1 the high in Charlottetown, and 5 degrees the high in St. John's, with rain and winds as well, winds up to 60 kilometers per hour. So there you have it. That's your forecast.
Stats Canada says the economy grew at an annual rate of 5.4% in the third quarter of this year. It outpaced economists' expectations for growth in real GDP between July and September. Stats Canada says household spending rose in the quarter as pandemic restrictions eased, which created a greater demand for exports. The quarter ended with the economy edging up 0.1% in September. The West Fraser Timber Company says severe weather and flooding in BC is affecting its lumber and pulp shipments. In the second half of November, the company's weekly shipments of Western Canadian lumber have fallen as much as 30%. Its pulp shipments to the Port of Vancouver have averaged less than 20% of normal volumes. Flooding and mudslides have cut several key transportation routes in BC, including highways and rail lines. A new report says most Canadian workers have experienced burnout during the pandemic. Human resources software company Ceridian says 84% of respondents reported feeling burned out over the past couple of years. At least 20% of those sought new jobs as a result. More than 450 workers surveyed described their level of burnout as high or extreme due to increased workloads, insufficient compensation, and mental health challenges. 39% say they'd consider leaving their current employer if the right opportunity came along. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 489 points on the day to 20,660. The Dow was down 652 points to 34,484. The S&P 500 was down 88 points on the day to 4567, and the Nasdaq was down 245 points on the day to 15,538. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down 377 today to 66.18 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 29 cents to 457 US. Gold was up a cent to 1774.53 US an ounce, and silver was even on the day at 22.83 US an ounce. Wheat is at $12.08 per bushel, barley's at $9.62, canola's at $21.18, and corn is at $10.49 per bushel. Live cattle were down $1.05 to $135.88. Feeder cattle were down 88 cents to $164.85, and lean hogs were up 98 cents to $73.38. The Canadian dollar was down slightly over the past 24 hours to 78.24 US. Recapping one of our top stories, BC has extended the state of emergency until December the 14th. Officials say this will ensure emergency services have all the resources they need after flooding devastated the province. It also extended its order limiting fuel purchases to 30 liters until the same date when the Trans Mountain Pipeline is hopefully back online. The family of a known terrorist, Jihadi Jack, wants the Canadian government to intervene, get him out of a Syrian jail, and bring him to Canada. Political reporter Brian Lilly will have more on that story in just a moment. The parents of a British known terrorist known as Jihadi Jack are wanting help from the Canadian government and politicians to help spring him from a prison in Syria to live a life of freedom here in Canada. To discuss this in more detail is political reporter and one of our regular contributors, Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilly. Brian, has anyone from Global Affairs Canada responded to this request?
Well, it would be public safety is the lead on this file, and so far they're being very non-committal. The father of Jack Letts, now Jack Letts is the man affectionately known in the media as Jihadi Jack, He is a Canadian citizen. He was born here, has lived in the UK for decades. He's coming to Ottawa next week to try and lobby MPs and senators to say, hey, look, my son needs to be sprung. He's a Canadian. Now, he's a Canadian by birth. He's never lived here. He was born, raised, educated in the United Kingdom. That's where he left from to go to Syria, to go join the Islamic State. And it is where I think he should return if the Kurdish jailers that are currently holding him in northern Syria want to let him go. But the Trudeau government, they've been asked about this before. They were asked about it just before the 2019 election. And all they would say is that, it's against the law for people to go and join groups like ISIS. And if somebody comes back, that they could be prosecuted. As I said, Mr. Letts, Jack Letts, has never lived here. Yesterday, Marco Mendicino, through a spokesperson, the current public safety minister, described how criminal prosecution could be in order, or peace bonds, or something else, if someone like Mr. Letts, he wouldn't get into any specific case, does come to Canada. They don't seem to be in any hurry to help him out. So I'm not sure that the parents will be getting a warm reception when they're in chilly Ottawa next week.
Brian, as the House of Commons prepared for a new session of hybrid parliament, the Deputy Speaker made kind of an odd request of MPs recently. What was it?
Well, I think you could sum it up as make sure you wear pants and don't go to the bathroom while your camera's on. We all remember the shenanigans of a Liberal MP last April, a guy named Will Amos. He decided not to run in the last election. I think the Liberal Party may have requested that he not run. He showed up naked on a session of hybrid parliament. He was on video camera and decided, he said, after a run to get changed. Well, MPs were shocked looking at their screens to see a naked man running by. I think any of us would be on a work meeting. Later on, about 6 weeks later, after he'd apologized and been embarrassed, he was caught relieving himself on camera. I'm not sure if he was peeing into a cup or a bottle or something, but he did this and again said, well, I didn't know. The MPs have to log in. There are multiple logins to get into the hybrid parliament. So the Deputy Speaker was reminding them, follow the decorum, make sure that you're dressed properly, make sure that you're wearing, if you're in the House of Commons and you have to wear a mask, that it's neutral, that you're not pushing a political statement or a brand, and just follow the rules, whether you're in person or via video conference. It shouldn't be that hard. They shouldn't need to be reminded, but obviously they did.
Now, the inflation crisis is driving up the price of everything, not just clothes. But when asked about it, what to do about it, because groceries are more expensive, clothing, rent, gas, the Trudeau Liberals only seem to have one answer, Brian: $10 a day daycare. So how will that really help seniors, single people, or those like myself who have adult children?
It won't help a lot of Canadians. I'm not sure why they think this is the answer. I mean, they do point out that inflation is a global problem, but there are steps that they could take inside Canada, including slowing down some of the government spending. Scotiabank has come out and said that. The chief economist at the Bank of Montreal, Doug Porter, has said that. This government has the foot on the accelerator of what is a global problem. So, that's why Canada has one of the highest inflation rates in the world. Everyone's dealing with it, but ours is higher, in part because of government spending, the Bank of Canada printing money, all of these measures that are in control of the government to some degree. They just answer with $10 a day childcare. Now, even if you have a kid who's 2 or 3, we're not going to get to the $10 a day childcare for 5 more years. You might see a reduction in cost next week or next year, but you're not going to see the $10 a day system. So your child will be in kindergarten or grade 1 when that comes in. On top of that, that doesn't really help you with the cost of everything else going up. So it's a bizarre strategy, but I just don't think that the government is in touch with where Canadians' heads are at on the issue of inflation. They seem completely out of touch, and it's not just the Prime Minister who, as we've talked about before, is the definition of a trust fund baby. It's his entire government. These are the only talking points they put forward. And I don't know about you, Hal, but I have noticed the price of everything going up at the grocery store. Just the other day, I was looking at an item and the sale price used to be the high price. Nobody's getting deals anywhere. And whether it is food, gas, natural gas to heat your home, rent, the cost of replacing things in your home, everything is going up. And the government just doesn't have a reasonable answer for it. They're seeming out of touch on this one.
You know, gas here in Lethbridge in southern Alberta is $1.45.9. What is it where you are in the nation or in Toronto there? What is it right now?
It just dropped in Toronto to about $1.35 this week, but it had been in the $1.45 range. But it dropped about 10 cents this week, and we're expecting it to go up by another couple of cents over the next little while. I can't imagine what it's going to be costing out in places like BC, where they're dealing with the floods, they're dealing with the ports being cut off at different points, and the whole supply chain issue.
You know, when I worked in Parliament Hill, when you and I were on the Hill together there in Ottawa, and I remember asking Justin Trudeau in a media veil, you know, in a scrum, what would you consider middle class? And he says, well, Canadians who make $150,000 a year, that's considered middle class. I'm like, what? And all of us reporters kind of looked at each other stunned. So maybe that goes to say something about how potentially out of touch Mr. Trudeau may be with the average Canadian. Now, Brian, with the rise of the new COVID-19 variant Omicron, the Trudeau Liberals did something it has not done in the past. And what was that?
Well, they did what I think they should have done at the first wave, at the second wave, third and fourth, and that's close the airports quickly to flights coming in from areas of concern. Now, I'm not calling for a full border shutdown. We don't need to go back to that. But if we know that this new variant that we don't know a lot about, and we still don't, there are some reports that it's more transmissible, worries that it's more deadly. Some are saying, no, it presents milder symptoms. But the truth is, Hal, we don't know. So what we do know is that it was very present in 7 countries across Southern Africa. It has apparently spread, including to here in Canada, but they moved quickly on Friday to say, okay, we're going to limit travel from those regions. We're going to stop. There are no direct flights from South Africa, but they're going to stop people and flights coming in. So if you're on a connector that came in after this rule change, unless you were a Canadian citizen, you weren't getting in. If you were a Canadian citizen, you had to be tested and quarantined. These are measures that we may have to do now and again as these things pop up. And one thing that I'd recommend is that the federal government in Ottawa seriously look at what the British government is doing in the UK. They have what's called a red list. And if your country is put on the red list, automatically a whole set of protocols kick in. If you're coming into the country from a red list destination, then testing protocols kick in, quarantine protocols kick in. This is not the first time that we've had a huge spike. You remember when it was India and Pakistan, it's because suddenly the percent positivity, the case ratio was off the charts. It went from nowhere to off the charts. And a lot of people were coming in from those countries infected into Canada. Each time we do this in Canada, we have to come up with a new set of policy ideas and proposals. And the government was scrambling a bit on Friday. We need to adopt the British proposal. If you're a problem, you're coming in from a problem spot, you're put on that list. Here's what happens. And it's automatic. We need to head in that direction for the next time this comes up.
Now, the ban on unvaccinated travelers officially takes effect now. Brian, wasn't this supposed to actually come into effect about a month ago?
Yeah, we were all told it would happen by the end of October, but what we missed was the extension for another month. And, again, the Trudeau government campaigned hard on, we'll make sure travelers are vaccinated and you can't get on a boat, a plane, or a train unless you're double vaccinated. And then was a couple days after it was supposed to come in, I was talking to someone who just got off the flight and I said, I was never asked. I didn't have to say a thing. Another person told me they just had to attest that they were vaccinated. But no, it kicks in now, November 30th, and goes on from here. We'll see how that changes. The Canada Border Services Agency has said that they have seized both fake tests and fake vaccination certificates at the border, hundreds of them. I'm sure that's just going to increase at this point. But yeah, if you thought it started at the end of October, you were wrong, just as I was.
Ryan, a lot of Canadians can't stand the L word, which is lockdown. Let me ask you something. Are we potentially headed back into a lockdown situation in many regions of the country? I mean, European nations were already headed that direction before the new variant.
European nations were headed in that direction before the new variant for a variety of reasons. One, they have much lower vaccination levels than we do in Canada. And in some cases, their cases per 100,000. I was looking at Austria and Slovakia last week when this was an issue, and they were 27 and 23 times higher than Canada. So, that is a marked difference. We're not talking 2 or 3 times higher, 27 and 23 times higher with a lower vaccination rate. So that is going to create bigger problems for your healthcare system. I know that here in Ontario, some people, are already talking about we need to bring in more measures and we need to bring back measures that we've gotten rid of and capacity limits. The chief medical officer here, who he's quite surprised me actually, Dr. Kieran Moore, has said, we don't want to go backwards unless we have to. We do not want to go backwards. So we'll pause on things. And so they paused the opening of nightclubs when cases started to rise, but they didn't reinstitute anything else. They just said, okay, nightclubs were supposed to go to full capacity, a couple of weeks ago. We'll wait on that for now and see how things go. I think we need to understand what this new variant is before taking drastic measures. And the Canadian Medical Association put out what should be a warning to governments across the country to think before they act. We've talked a lot about the deaths caused by suicides, overdoses, missed medical treatments. They've now quantified that at about 4,000, and they've said that the medical system across the country needs an investment of $1.3 billion from the federal government to bring provincial spending back up to where it was pre-pandemic. So there are harmful side effects to a lockdown. We know more than we did when we first started this. Let's be smart about it. If we end up in a lockdown, let's hope it's only because there's no other option, such as hospitals actually being flooded and beyond capacity. We're not there yet. Let's hope we don't get there.
Brian, absolutely. We've noticed, since the start of the pandemic that depression and anxiety rates have gone through the roof. We've spoken to many health experts about that, including a lot of clinical psychologists. Brian, Canada and the United States continue to have ongoing trade irritants. And last week, the United States slammed Canada with yet another tariff. It doesn't appear as though the Biden administration really is a friend of Canada's.
Yeah, with friends like Joe Biden, who needs enemies? Because Justin Trudeau was just down there a couple of weeks ago. And of course, he was one of the big things that he was there for, and we talked about it at the time, was to try and put an end to these tax incentives that Biden wants to give to electric vehicles that have to be made in the United States. And there's worries that, this could really hurt Canada's auto industry. Well, they passed that the morning Trudeau was leaving Washington. They almost passed it while he was there at a fancy dinner. And Biden went to Detroit while Trudeau was in Washington to promote that very idea. A couple days after Trudeau gets back, they banned PEI potatoes over something that Canada has long said is not an irritant. Well, it was actually Canada. It was the Trudeau government that banned them because the Biden government said, if you don't, we will, and we'll take extra steps. And then last week, towards the end of last week, they doubled the tariff on softwood lumber. In 2006, this softwood lumber has been going on for decades, but in 2006, Stephen Harper was able to get a deal with the Bush administration in Washington. $5 billion was returned to Canadian producers in tariffs that had been taken. There was about a decade of peace. And then in 2015, when the agreement expired, Trudeau hasn't done anything. He hasn't been able to get a deal with Obama. He couldn't get a deal with Trump. And he can't get a deal with Biden. The only thing on this particular file that might save Canadian producers is you've got a lot of Americans dealing with their own inflation crisis. And Joe Biden just put up the cost of a new house because a lot of that softwood lumber goes into new home construction across the United States.
Brian, Barbados has officially become a republic and dropped Queen Elizabeth as the head of state. Now, an Angus Reid poll shows that many Canadians would back the same move for our country after Queen Elizabeth passes away.
Yeah, it's as high as 72% Quebec, which won't surprise anybody, but it is a majority in the rest of the country that says when Queen Elizabeth passes, we're not really interested in carrying on with King Charles. And I don't think that's going to be a shock to an awful lot of people. Prince Charles is not endeared himself to an awful lot of people. I don't think movies like Spencer, which is in theaters now, generally help him. I don't think TV shows like The Crown generally help him. I will say that I was able to cover Prince Charles on a visit to Canada several years ago when he was visiting with veterans at the National War Memorial, and he quite surprised me how warm and engaged he was, how as soon as he was talking to any particular veteran, they had his undivided 100% attention. So he surprised me, but that's not a side most Canadians see. And women over the age of 55 are the most attached to the monarchy, but even they are less likely to be on board with continuing once Charles takes the throne.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilly, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.
Professional athletes have a large influence on young people today, far more so than in generations past. Some are good influences, others not so much. We're going to take a look at how Christian athletes influence society and how the universal language of sports can be a tool to reach people's spiritual needs. We're joined by Pastor Harold Cooper from the Central Church of Christ in Lethbridge. Pastor Harold, welcome to the show. So great to see you again.
Hey, it's fantastic to be able to see you. And I need to put a disclaimer up right at the start.
Okay.
Though I've worked with athletes and been in the athletic world for a long time, I am not the athlete. I'm just clear evidence that God has a sense of humor when he put me in that world.
Well, you have a sense of humor too, Harold. So I understand that you were formerly on staff with an organization called Athletes in Action. And so now you still do some volunteer work with them as well, as I understand. So can you, first of all, maybe explain what this organization is?
Sure. In the early 70s, Athletes in Action got started because at that time in the Canadian Football League, there was no chaplaincy program. There was no platform for athletes who were becoming new believers or who already were to really have any connection. And so a group of guys, players and ministry leaders got together and they had a burden to use the platform of sports to have an influence in Canada, and in particular at that time within the Canadian Football League. So the short story is they established Athletes in Action, set up a chaplaincy ministry with the league. It took a while before every team would be open to it because this is in the early 70s and sport and Jesus were like way disconnected. The church wasn't even sure what to do about Christian athletes because they were playing on Sunday. Young kids weren't encouraged to be in sport because it conflicted. And, there was a whole cultural difference than what we have today. And so they were really pioneers and they established the chaplaincy program. And then they realized they had a platform of influence and they started going to schools and they started doing community events. And one of those was the Grey Cup breakfast that I think got started in maybe 1976 and has continued ever since. And so the Grey Cup coming up in Hamilton, there will be maybe 700 to 1,000 people that will gather to hear the testimony of athletes and coaches, some of whom are in that game, and they will openly share about what Jesus has meant to them. So it sort of got started in the CFL, has branched now into divisions such as campus ministries, camp ministries for kids, international partnerships, and the establishment of international ministries. So AIA Canada is connected with AIA globally. And so from those small beginnings in the States in the 50s and in Canada in the 70s, there are Athletes in Action ministries of one size or scale or another all around the world.
That's amazing. I had no idea what the scale of that was either. Now, Harold, you spent a number of years as a chaplain to the Saskatchewan Roughriders. So what was that like?
So keeping in mind my disclaimer right at the start,
yeah.
I'm this short 5'6" guy. This was in 1996 when I went to become the full-time chaplain. I had been there in 1995 for the Grey Cup breakfast. That was the one with the Baltimore Stallions, I think. They won. It was freezing cold. The greatest sign was a guy over in the stands with a big sign that said, "At least there's no mosquitoes," right? So the involvement with me with the team was riddled with lots of fun, and actually insecurities as well, because here was this small guy with these massive men, elite athletes in our nation. And I'm going, okay, so how do I fit in? So what was it like? At times it was intimidating. At times it was fearful. It just reminded me of a biblical truth that we are called to be ambassadors for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so it doesn't matter our size or shape. One of my great lines during that season was, when God measures a person, he wraps the tape around their heart, right? And so athletes are measured in all kinds of capacities. And it was just a privilege, really, to be able to be involved. I got to go to Grey Cup games. I got to be with the players on the field. But more importantly, I had a chance to meet one-to-one and to do the pre-game chapels and to do Bible studies with the athletes for a season of time. In Regina, we had a coach's off season. Really, it's just the non-playing season because they're hard at it. So we used to do Bible studies with them. So every morning, once a week, we'd get together and pray together and study scripture and work our way through. So it was a great privilege and really a great honor to be involved. But there are some very odd and strange things as well.
I bet. Well, that's really fascinating. And I do remember, just as a side note, I do remember when they had the U.S. expansion teams with Baltimore. I was actually a cheerleader for the Blue Bombers during that time. So this might have been around the same time frame if it was back in the 90s. So there you go.
It was, that's for sure.
I have to ask, so how did these players who weren't Christians respond to you? Did anyone ever ask you for advice or for prayer?
So in the chaplaincy program, in many ways, you function like a pastor, not only to the players and the coaches, but even the whole organization. And so there were times when, like for weddings, if they were looking for somebody and they didn't have a church, I'd had a chance to do some of the weddings, particularly for some of the players. You did a fair amount of one-to-one mentorship and discipleship, where the common experience for a number of the athletes can be something like this. They grew up playing football, and particularly in the States, they might have been involved with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes because they have a high school chaplaincy program. So, and for many of our American players, and there's a distinction in terms of their spiritual history, for many of them, it was mom, the flag, and church, right? And so they grew up sort of doing that. And so they had a much stronger faith connection than our Christian or our Canadian players, rather.
Yeah, family, faith, and football is kind of their motto.
Yes, it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. And so whether it was intimate and personal in the relationship with Jesus, or sort of just a cultural, this is what we do. Because they would be used to pre-game prayer. Okay. They would be used to a chapel. And so oftentimes something would trigger in their life, not unlike almost everyone, something would trigger in their life to prompt them to start to consider about spiritual things. And so then they would often start talking with one of the Christian players, who would then go, hey, look, why don't you start coming out to Bible study? Or why don't you start coming out to chapel? And so my role was to create a safe place, a confidential place. The chaplains aren't paid by the team at all to keep sort of a neutrality there. So on lots of occasions, I would spend a fair amount of time one-to-one mentoring, discipleship style of work with them. And like I say, weddings, when there's a crisis, I didn't have to deal with a death while I was there, but other chaplains over the years have had to deal with loss of life issues, either with the player or some of the staff, those types of things. But the fun thing for me was actually, as a chaplain, doing the baptism side of things. As players would work through that faith journey, they would make a decision for Jesus and go, so now what? So then we'd have conversations around that. So yeah, it was great.
That's amazing. So your role it was volunteer, and you're just giving up so much of your time to do this.
Right. So as a chaplain, I was full-time staff. So I was like a missionary with Campus Crusade for Christ. It's now called Power to Change. So we raised our support, trusted God for those resources. And then as I shifted in my ministry away from full-time with Athletes in Action and went into sports camps, that's a whole other thing. I still retained a connection because when I was with the riders, I was asked if I would consider launching Athletes in Action in Zambia. And so I started taking players and athletes and coaches, and we did international projects in Southeast Africa. So I can remember one occasion where we were in Kenya, and we had 3 full-time players at that time. And we were out in this rural area, and it was the, I can't even remember the name, but it was like a Methodist Baptist, the African Methodist Baptist, something. And so we went into this dirt chapel, and one of our guys just wept and wept. He grew up in Georgia, and the church looked very much like what he could remember as a little kid. And he went, it was just like in the movie, he goes like, I found my roots. I found my history. I found my life, and just to create opportunities like that for them to have that experience. So now I continue as a volunteer with Athletes in Action in the international side. So I'm not so much in the major outreaches or things like that, but I still help facilitate international projects and training athletes and coaches and administrators in their country to start just like it did here in Canada.
Yeah. Well, we started this interview talking a little bit about how oftentimes sports people are role models. Young people look up to them. So what are some of the pros and cons, in your opinion, of looking up to pro athletes as models for our children?
So it's a fantastic question because it begs an even bigger picture, but I won't go there. I'll just make the aside. I think every believer is a role model, right? And so some of us do better at that than others, depending upon our life place. So what I've learned over long years of ministry is the story's never over. So we've got these players that we see for a small window of time, and they're in the middle of, for some of them, a very early story. So yes, without any reservation, they are having an influence. Sport is having a phenomenal influence in the world. I think that's evidenced with the number of the issues like the Black Lives Matter, whether players will stand or kneel for the national anthem. And so that platform is huge when you consider, like at an NFL game, there could be close to 90 to 100,000 people in the stands. Like that's bigger than the entire town of Lethbridge. So, when you think of all of those people and they're watching and what every one of those players do, especially I think more so because of social media availability to be followed and all those kinds of things, the use of media by the players, it can be incredible, but there's always risks, right? Because there's a Bible verse, I think, that says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So we find people in the middle of their stories, and when they fall, we tend to sort of be far more harsh on them. I had a phrase that said, remember where you came from so you can offer grace to those who still live there. So you have the incredible positive influence, which is why we go into schools and sports and athletes and things are, they're sought after because their life experience has given them a platform. And that platform can be either used or abused. And so really it's the character of that athlete. And so I keep encouraging people, look to the athlete, but look to the life behind the athlete that is making him or her to be who they are.
Oh, that's such great advice. And we see so many of these stories coming out with athletes, and some of them aren't the greatest stories. And I would imagine it's a huge challenge when an athlete makes a moral failure. It gets a lot of media attention, and the young kids, they're paying attention. I mean, this just recently happened with the Las Vegas Raider who was driving drunk and killed a young woman. I think that happened just last week. So we're seeing these crazy stories coming out of these athletes.
And I think part of it is like there might be a need inherently for people to have somebody to look up to. And that's valuable. That's important. But choosing who that person is might be better differentiated by not necessarily the position or achievement that they've gotten to, but that the character and personality that they demonstrate. Because like Tim Tebow and his family, and like there's others that are doing unbelievably wonderful things with the amazing funds that they have, the platform that they have, and they're really making a difference. But that's grown out of a character that has been cultivated or transformed to have them think beyond themselves. And I think the problem with sport is it has this constant identity issue that, you know, you're the somebody. And yes, they've worked hard to get there, unbelievably hard. But behind all of that is somebody who has coached them, cared for them, encouraged them. Nobody gets to the top by themselves, and nobody becomes an elite athlete without an unbelievable coach who just believed in them until they could believe for themselves. So I think that's the big challenge with the athletes. It's sort of wherever they come from is going to be far more critical, because that will often dictate where they're going to wind up. But we don't always know the backstory.
Oh gosh, and
as you know.
Exactly. And there's just so much to unpack here, but unfortunately, we're out of time. We could have gone on and talked about this and talked about coaches' influences and great sports camps for kids. So we'll just have to have you back on again.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Thanks so much, Pastor Harold, for being with us today. We really appreciate you.
See ya. My joy. It's always a joy. See ya.
Harold Cooper
Bye-bye.
is the pastor of Central Church of Christ in Lethbridge. I'm Jeanette Roche. On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, thanks for watching.